Of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, John has become my favorite. Not because of the name we share, but because of the way he describes the events of his time with Jesus, particularly when those same events show up in multiple Gospels, like the feeding of the 5,000, and this account of Mary and the disciples at the tomb. While the same basic facts of the big story of Jesus' ministry overlap fairly well between the four accounts, it is John who remembers the small details. He retells them in a way that helps me to see those events in a different and deeper way. It was John that remembered it was a small boy from the crowd who had walked up with the 5 small loaves and the 2 small fish. Almost exactly 1 year later, it is John who is right there next to Peter at the Last Supper, again in the courtyard of the high priest where Peter denies knowing Christ, and then yet again the next morning when they race to the tomb after Mary finds it empty. John isn't the first to find the tomb empty. He isn't even the first of the disciples to enter. He waits by the entrance and lets Peter go in first. But he notices the arrangement of the linen strips and the placement of the cloth, and he is the first to believe. He knows the body wasn't removed by soldiers or grave robbers, neither of whom would have taken the care to replace these items in the arrangement that John witnesses and then shares with us. There are estimates that more than 90% of the material in John's Gospel is unique, focused on the small details, the conversations, observations, and the context that help us to feel like we're included in the key parts of the story. Because we are. Because this is a human story as much as it is divine. The events of Holy Week, between Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey and the discovery of his resurrection a week later, in them you will find every element of the human condition on display. It is a roller coaster of emotions that mirrors everything we will experience in our lifetime. There's triumph, betrayal, there's pride and humiliation, fear, grief, confusion, pain, and relief. There's hopelessness, there's joy, and there's anger. It's all there. Just as for many of us, it's all right here, right now. These past few weeks have been something of a roller coaster for most of us. If you're like me, you found yourself connecting or reconnecting with people in a new and sometimes deeper way than you did before this virus changed all of our lives. Without many of the demands and distractions that had piled up around us, we are working through a way to fill the hours in ways that we didn't have a choice about just a few weeks or months ago. This mixture of boredom, helplessness, fear, and anxiety are squeezing many of us in uncomfortable ways. If all of us can't be on the front lines of this thing, in the hospitals, the clinics and labs, grocery stores and warehouses, interstates and railways that keep moving through the long hours of the night, still, we are coping with it in the ways that we are best equipped, with humor and sarcasm, creativity and affection, cooking, and sharing what little information and hope we can find. But from time to time, the feelings we wish we could control better come leaking around the edges, in unexpected sadness, in inexplicable grief, and in explosions of anger. I can't help noticing that it's not the big events that are triggering these releases. It's the little things. A song you remember from a simpler time. The thought of Augusta National at the peak of its spring beauty, empty and silent. The chirp of birds instead of the roars of the Sunday crowds filtering through the trees. In the absence of an imminent cure or a call to arms, we convince ourselves that it would all just be okay if that group of kids would stop congregating at the rec center, or goofing off out on the sandbar. If folks would just properly observe the one-way arrows and blue tape on the supermarket aisle floors, take the time to throw away their own gloves in the parking lot, we might just have a chance to beat this thing. 1,000 more respirators, 6 feet of distance, and the right kind of mask would save us, if only people would do the right thing. If you're old enough to remember Andy Rooney, then you can probably imagine what he would be saying about now. If you're not, you can imagine what Carl Frederickson from the movie Up would say. You'd probably be close enough. They noticed the little things. They remembered why they mattered. They realized how quickly they could turn into the big things, the things that spiral out of control. If you look at the folks who were so eager to see Jesus crucified, and they seemed unrecognizable to you, just remember that the Romans weren't the first foreign power to conquer and occupy Israel. These things were usually brought on because their leaders weren't following the laws that God had given to Moses, and they didn't end until everyone learned their lesson and went back to the basics. If healing someone on the Sabbath seemed trivial, they would have been just as concerned about the rules to social distancing, and just as angry that some of us didn't get it. They knew that things would never get better and had the opportunity to get much, much worse if we all didn't just shape up and get with the program. If others had been trying for more than a year to drag Jesus up to Jerusalem and declare him king, it was because they were sure that every problem they had could be fixed by the kind of heroic leader that had saved Israel in the past. Because they knew deep down that it was the obscene wealth, the power, and the decadence of Rome that was causing all of their problems. If they could just get rid of the crooked tax collectors and the corrupt government officials who were taking advantage of the situation, everything could be made right again. They were angry because they felt powerless. They felt helpless. They had no hope, no justice, and no peace to comfort them. Because they couldn't take it out on those far away who held power over them, they took it out on the only ones they could, each other. Because that's what we do. It's what we've always done. It's what we're doing right now. We have been for a while, long before we knew what a coronavirus was. A few Easters back, I took the time to find some maps of the major Roman roads of Jesus' time. If you look at the empire that had so much of people's attention during the time of Jesus, you realize that Israel is just one small corner down at the bottom of the map. Jerusalem isn't even on one of the major Roman roads, and most of the places in the Gospel aren't either. If you unrolled that map in Rome, everywhere that Jesus walked was probably covered by the heavy object that you would put down in the corner to keep the map from rolling back up again. It helped me to understand, as much as I want to blame Washington or China, who don't even know that I exist, or as much as I might wish for a perfect leader to fix all this, who I'm pretty sure won't be on the ballot in my lifetime, they just aren't as important as I always give them credit for being. Because it doesn't take much to make me realize how fragile, flawed, and helpless they've all become when the big things start happening in God's plan. I looked back on that map this week, and I started to see a lot of place names I did recognize on the major highways. Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, Laodicea, which is right next door to Colossia, Antioch and Galatia. You won't have heard most of those names from a travel agent, but if you start looking at the books of the New Testament that come after John and the Acts of the Apostles, you will realize why most of them are pretty familiar. You see, In the story that God was writing, the Roman Empire wasn't the problem. It was all part of the plan. God timed everything that we think of as the New Testament to coincide with the completion of what we might also think of as the interstate highway system of its time. The road to Emmaus, where the unrecognized Jesus joins his followers after the resurrection, was maintained by Rome. So was the road to Damascus, where Saul of Tarsus began his transformation into Paul, and then wrote the letters of the early church that bear the names of those same towns in your Bible today. I know the coronavirus, the stock market, and the new unemployment claims look bad right now, because they are. I know the 6-foot rule, one-way travel in grocery stores, and whether the beaches are closed don't seem like life and death choices to everyone, but they feel like that to more people than you can imagine. But I also know that God's plan is bigger than these things, and bigger than we can imagine. That the real story isn't happening in Wuhan, Washington, or the offices of the WHO. It's happening somewhere on the map that is being covered up by a coffee cup, or a display of how much the Dow is up or down today. It's happening all around you. Because the real story always was, and always will be, how well we look out for one another, forgive each other, minister to each other, give to each other, and heal each other. How well we work through grief and anger to find peace and reconciliation. Because everything before that point is about coming to terms with the truth before we are able to embrace it. And the truth is, God loves you. He always has. He is looking out for you, even now. He has a plan for your life, and it involves how well you are able to identify the unique gift that He had stored up inside of you for this exact moment. Because no amount of respirators would be sufficient if this had been as bad as some had predicted. But neither could we understand how many can and will be saved by grace, by selflessness, by so many people doing the right thing to look out for the most vulnerable among us. And if along the way we found that God had given us all a unique period of reflection, of reversion to the most basic elements of faith, of family, of rest and prayer, would it be any less miraculous than the way He changed the hearts of those who witnessed these events of that Easter week long, long ago? Are we any less equipped to go forward from this Sunday, changed by what we have seen, what we have learned, and how we had grown in our faith along the way? This story is not over, any more than it was on the cross or in the tomb. It has just begun, and the evidence of the miracle is all around you, in the little things we stop to notice, and on the side roads way down in the forgotten corner of the map. Because by the time this is over, many will have died, but many more will have been reborn to go back out into the world and reflect the example of Christ in each day yet to come. Amen.